She held out her hand and looked at me like I was supposed to argue. I didn't. That's the part nobody expected. Not Lauren, not my son Eric, who was standing just behind her in the doorway of my study with his arms crossed and his eyes pointed at the floor the way they've pointed at the floor every time in his life when he knew something was wrong and decided not to say so. Not even me, if I'm being completely honest. I'd thought about this moment before, wondered how it would go if it ever came. But when it actually arrived, on a gray Thursday afternoon in Boise, with the heating making its usual noise and the smell of the old paper from my shelves filling the room the way it always does, I found I was calmer than I'd expected. Lauren said, "Give me the key to the safe." She said it the way a person says something they've been rehearsing. Direct, no cushioning. The kind of delivery that's meant to leave the other person no room to redirect the conversation before it started. I looked at her for a moment. Just a moment. She's 43 years old, Lauren, and she has a face that doesn't hide what she's feeling even when she wants it to. Right then, what she was feeling was determination. The particular kind that comes from having made a decision somewhere private and then pushed it all the way to the point of saying it out loud to the person it concerns. I thought, for just a second, that maybe I'd misheard her. I hadn't. She said it again. "You heard me. Give me the key." I looked past her at Eric. He didn't look up. That told me everything I needed to know about how this had gone in their house before they drove over here. It told me he knew she was going to say it. It told me he hadn't stopped her. And it told me that whatever combination of love and conflict and private negotiation had brought them to my study door on a Thursday afternoon, Eric had arrived already having chosen his position, which was to let his wife take the lead and keep his own hands out of it. I've known my son for 47 years. I understand that about him. He avoids the kind of confrontation that requires him to stand in the middle of two people he cares about and say something that will hurt one of them. It's not a character flaw, exactly. It's more like a limitation, a place where the courage runs out earlier than it should. I opened the top drawer of the desk. The key was there where it always is, on a small metal ring with nothing else attached to it. Just the key. Brass, old, slightly worn from the drawer, even though I hadn't opened the drawer in a few days. Small enough to fit in a coat pocket, and easy enough to lose if you weren't the kind of person who put things back exactly where they belonged. I am that kind of person. I picked it up. I looked at it for a second. Then I placed it directly into Lauren's open hand. She stared at me. This was not what she'd prepared for. She had prepared for resistance, for questions, for the particular kind of careful deflection that older men deploy when they want to delay a conversation without technically refusing to have it. She had prepared for me to ask why, or to say the safe was none of her business, or to suggest they sit down first and talk it through. She had not prepared for me to simply hand it over. I said, "Go ahead." She looked at the key in her palm, then at me, then at the safe, which sits against the wall behind the desk, to the left of the window that looks out over the creek that gives this street its name. It's not a large safe. It's not the kind of thing you'd notice immediately when you walked into the room. Just a gray steel box about the size of a piece of carry-on luggage sitting on a low shelf between two stacks of old binders. She walked toward it. I watched her go. I didn't say anything else. I didn't look at Eric, though I was aware of him the way you're aware of weather, something present that's making itself felt without making a sound. Lauren crouched in front of the safe. She inserted the key. Her hands were steady. I'll give her that. Whatever she'd been feeling in the car on the way over, or in the kitchen of their house that morning when she'd decided today was the day, she'd pulled it back down to something manageable by the time the key went in. The lock clicked. The door opened. She looked inside. I watched her face. I've spent 74 years reading faces. Not deliberately, not as a skill I cultivated, just as a consequence of paying attention to the world around me the way my father taught me to, which was thoroughly and without assumptions. A man who spent 4 decades supervising postal routes and weather that didn't care about anybody's schedule learns to read what's coming before it arrives. What arrived on Lauren's face in the few seconds after that safe door opened was not what she expected to find there. Her expression shifted the way a room shifts when the light changes. First, there was confusion, then something slower. Then she stopped breathing for a moment. Just a moment. The kind of pause that happens when the body decides it needs to stop and pay attention to something the mind hasn't caught up with yet. And then she began to cry. Not loudly, not dramatically. The quiet kind of crying that people do when something reaches a place inside them they didn't know was accessible. The kind you can't really prepare for because you didn't know the door was there. I let that sit. Eric had finally looked up. He was watching his wife with an expression caught somewhere between alarm and confusion, and I knew from that expression that he didn't know what was in the safe any more than she had. He'd let her come here on the strength of her certainty without asking what she expected to find. That was its own kind of information. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me go back a bit. Let me tell you how a gray Thursday in Boise got to that room in the first place, because the day Lauren put her hand out and asked me for that key didn't start on Thursday. It started a long time before that. It started with a woman named Margaret and a promise, and a small brass key that I have kept in the top drawer of that desk for more than a decade without telling anyone what it opened. Margaret was my wife for 41 years. She passed 11 years ago this coming March, and there isn't a morning that goes by that I don't have some version of her in my thoughts before I've finished my first cup of coffee. Not always grief, sometimes just presence. The way certain people become part of the structure of a life rather than just a person inside it. That's what Margaret was to me. She was structural, and when she was gone, the parts of the life she'd held up had to find other ways to hold. I retired from the Postal Service after 38 years. 32 of those years I spent as a route supervisor, which is a job that sounds more administrative than it is. You're responsible for the routes and the carriers and the equipment and the scheduling and the 1,000 small decisions that have to happen in the right order before 6 in the morning so that everyone else's morning runs the way they expect it to. It's work that requires a particular temperament. You have to care enough to get everything right and detach enough not to take it personally when things go wrong. And you have to be able to hold both of those things at the same time without letting either one tip too far. Margaret said that's why I was good at it. She said I had the right kind of patience, not the passive kind, not the kind that just waits for things to resolve themselves, the active kind, the kind that watches and prepares and then knows exactly when to move. She was right, though it took me years to understand what she meant. The house on Winding Creek Avenue has been mine since 1991. Margaret and I bought it when Eric was in his 20s, and we'd finally saved enough to stop renting and put something permanent under our feet. It's not a large house by any standard you'd apply today. 3 bedrooms, a study, a kitchen that Margaret reorganized twice over the years until it worked the way she wanted it to work. A backyard that backs up against the creek, which runs well enough in spring and goes quiet in the dry months. A neighborhood that's changed considerably since we moved in and now has the slightly self-conscious character of a place that knows it's been discovered. The study was always mine. Margaret had no argument with that. She had her own spaces in the house, the kitchen obviously, but also a particular chair in the living room where she did her reading in the evenings, and a corner of the bedroom where she kept her correspondence and her notebooks and the things she wanted close to where she slept. She respected my study the way I respected her chair. Some spaces in a shared life are held individually, and that's not selfishness, that's architecture. The safe came into the study in 2003. Not because I had anything of significant financial value to protect. I've never been a wealthy man in the monetary sense. I built a comfortable life through decades of careful work and careful spending and the kind of financial discipline that people who've lived through uncertain periods tend to maintain out of habit long after the uncertainty is gone. But wealth? No, just sufficiency, which, I'll tell you, is its own kind of abundance if you understand what you're measuring. I bought the safe because Margaret asked me to. She came to me one afternoon in 2003 with a specific request, which was unusual. Margaret was not a woman who made requests lightly. She preferred to manage her own concerns herself and present you with the result rather than involve you in the process. When she came to me with a request, it was because she thought it through completely and determined that she needed something from me specifically. She said she had been collecting things. She said she'd been collecting them for a while. She said she wanted a place to keep them that wouldn't get disturbed, that wouldn't get thrown out by accident, that would be there intact when the time came to do something with them. I asked her what she was collecting. She said, things worth remembering. That was Margaret. Precise in the way she used words. She didn't mean objects in the decorative sense. She meant objects that carried weight, things that represented something that deserved to be preserved. I asked her why a safe. She said, because I want to know they're somewhere safe. I asked her what she meant by when the time came. She looked at me in the particular way she had when she thought I was asking a question I already knew the answer to. She said, "You'll know." I bought the safe the following week. I put it in the study. I gave Margaret a key and kept one for myself, and I watched over the next several years as she occasionally went into the study and added things to it. She never showed me what she was adding. She never explained the collection in detail. She just tended it the way she tended the garden in the backyard, with a quiet regularity that didn't require an audience. After she passed, I sat with the safe for a long time before I opened it. Months, actually. There's a particular quality to a deceased person's private things that I think people underestimate until they're faced with it. It's not just sadness. It's a kind of respect that doesn't know quite what to do with itself. You want to honor what they kept private without dishonoring their absence by leaving the private things permanently sealed. It takes time to find the balance. When I finally opened it, I understood what she'd been doing for all those years, and I understood with a clarity that stayed with me every day since that the safe wasn't mine in any meaningful sense. It was something she'd built, something she'd left in my keeping, something that was waiting. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand the specific weight of what I held in my hand when Lauren put her palm out on that Thursday afternoon. I want you to understand that when I placed that key into her hand without argument, without question, without the resistance she'd prepared herself for, it was not because I didn't care what happened next. It was because I'd spent 11 years waiting for the moment when what was inside that safe would find the person it was meant to reach. I just hadn't known, until she walked into my study and held out her hand, that the person was Lauren. Let me tell you about Lauren. She came into Eric's life about 18 years ago. They met the way people meet now, through the specific intersection of circumstance and persistence that has always been the actual mechanism of how people find each other, whatever the decade's explanation for it might be. She is a composed woman in most respects, capable, forward-thinking, the kind of person who plans 3 moves ahead in most situations and trusts the plan over improvisation. She grew up in a family that experienced real financial instability, not catastrophic poverty, but the particular grinding anxiety of a household where the numbers were always close to the edge and sometimes went over it. She's told Eric about this, and Eric has told me fragments. Not because anyone intended for me to have a full picture, but because the fragments came out over years of ordinary conversation. What I assembled from those fragments was this. Lauren's relationship with financial security is not casual. It never has been. For her, money is not primarily a tool or a comfort or a status signal. It is the specific thing that stands between a person and the version of life she grew up inside. The version where nothing is certain and everything depends on circumstances you can't control. I don't judge her for that. I understand it. I've understood it for years, long before that Thursday. Long before the key. Margaret understood it too. That's the part I hadn't known how to tell anyone. Now. The reason Lauren believed the safe contained something financially significant was because of a conversation she'd had with Eric about 6 months before that Thursday. Eric had mentioned, in the way people mention things they haven't thought carefully enough about, that his mother had always been careful with money, that she'd always said there were things she'd set aside, that she'd always talked about there being something for later. Lauren heard something for later, and her mind, which is trained by experience to translate financial language very specifically, heard a promise. She wasn't wrong that Margaret had set things aside. She was wrong about what kind of things, but she didn't know that yet. And Eric, who had heard the same conversations with his mother over the years and remembered them through the filter of his own interpretation, hadn't thought carefully enough about what he actually knew versus what he'd assumed. So there was a misunderstanding, built from fragments, assembled in the dark, presented to me on a Thursday afternoon in the form of a woman with her hand extended and a look in her eyes that contained more fear than it contained demand if you knew how to look. The financial pressure Eric mentioned to me in our calls over the preceding months was real. Not invented, not exaggerated for sympathy. Real. The particular kind that builds slowly and then suddenly feels all-encompassing. The way certain structural problems work. Fine for a long time, then not fine at all, and then the distance between those two states feels impossibly short when you're standing inside the not fine. Lauren had decided the safe was the answer. She had decided that whatever Margaret had set aside, whatever the something for later actually was, it belonged to them now, or at least the knowledge of it did. And that Sam keeping it private was no longer a kindness or a reasonable boundary. It was an obstacle. That's how she arrived in my study. That's how the hand went out. That's how the key moved from the drawer to her palm in the space of 30 seconds, without either of us saying anything more significant than go ahead. When the safe opened and Lauren began to cry, Eric crossed the room in 3 steps. He put his hand on her shoulder. He looked into the safe. His face went through a version of the same recalibration hers had gone through, though slower, because Eric processes things slowly and thoroughly, like a man reading a document he wants to get right the first time. He looked at me. I was still sitting in my chair behind the desk. He said, "Dad, what is all this?" I said, "It's what your mother kept." He said, "But what is it?" I said, "Pull up those chairs, both of you. There's a right order to this, and I'd like to go through it properly." Lauren wiped her face. She was still crouched in front of the safe. She hadn't touched anything inside it. I noticed that. Whatever impulse had driven her to demand the key had stopped the moment the door opened, as though opening it had been the goal. And now that the goal was achieved, some other instinct had taken over. The instinct to be careful. Eric brought 2 chairs from the corner of the study. They sat down. Lauren held the key in both hands, not quite ready to give it back, not quite sure what to do with it. I looked at the 2 of them sitting across the desk from me in a room full of 40 years of record-keeping, and I thought about Margaret. About the afternoon in 2003, when she'd come to me with her specific request. About the way she'd said, "You'll know," with that look that meant she trusted me to understand something she didn't feel the need to explain in full. I thought she was right. I know. I said, "There are 7 things in that safe." I said, "I'm going to tell you about each one of them." I said, "And before I'm done, you're going to understand something about your mother that I don't think either of you has ever fully understood." The heating made its noise. The creek outside ran quietly in the gray afternoon. I looked at my son and his wife sitting in the chairs Margaret used to sit in when she came into the study to talk to me about things that mattered. I said, "Let's start with the watch." Lauren looked up. Eric leaned forward slightly, and the room settled into the specific quality of silence that arrives when people understand, without being told, that whatever comes next is going to ask something of them. The watch was not the most important thing in the safe, but it was the right place to start, because what the watch explained about Eric's parents would change, before the afternoon was over, how Eric understood the silence he'd chosen when Lauren held out her hand. And what came after the watch? The letters, the photographs, the envelope, and finally the one wrapped item that Margaret had told me never to open until the moment arrived. That was something none of us in that room were entirely ready for, including me. The watch is small. That's the first thing you notice about it if you pick it up, which I did that afternoon, carefully. The way you handle something that has survived longer than most of the context that made it meaningful. It fits in the center of a palm with room on all sides. Silver casing, not expensive silver, the kind of silver that comes from a department store in a mid-range display case and costs what a working couple could afford in a difficult year. The face is simple. No complications, as watchmakers call the extra features. Just hands and numbers and a winding crown on the side that hasn't been wound in more than a decade. It stopped at 4:22. I don't know if that's morning or afternoon. I never reset it. After Margaret put it in the safe, I set it on the desk between me and the 2 of them, and I let them look at it for a moment before I said anything. Eric leaned forward the way he does when he's trying to read something from a distance, rather than commit to reaching for it. Lauren sat very still. She'd stopped crying, but her eyes still had that quality of someone who's been somewhere emotional and hasn't fully come back yet. Eric said, "That's not yours?" I said, "No, it's yours." He looked at me. I said, "Your mother bought that watch in 1994. You were 23. You just come through a period that she and I talked about for a long time afterward." Eric knew which period I meant. I could see it in the way his shoulders moved slightly, the kind of small physical response that happens when a memory lands without warning. In 1994, Eric had gone through about 8 months of genuine uncertainty. He'd lost a job he thought was stable, taken on work that paid less, and spent most of that year in a kind of quiet free fall that he managed largely by himself and told us very little about until it was mostly over. That was characteristic of him even then. He handled difficulty privately and reported results, not process, but Margaret had known. She always knew. She had a particular sensitivity to Eric's emotional weather that functioned like a barometer. She didn't need him to tell her things were hard. She could read it in the length of his phone calls and the specific way he said fine when she asked how things were going. Fine, to Margaret, was never just fine. It was a weather report. During that stretch, she made a decision. She didn't tell me about it at the time. I found out much later, in fragments, the way I found out most things Margaret did quietly. She took money from the household budget over the course of several months. Not a large amount each time, small amounts, the kind that don't register as significant individually, but accumulate into something meaningful over time. She put it aside. And when Eric came through the other side of that year and was back on stable ground, she didn't give him the money. She bought the watch. She put it in a box, and she put the box in a drawer, and she didn't give it to him then either. She gave it to me instead. She said, "Keep this somewhere, it won't get lost." I said, What's it for?" She said, "It's for the right conversation." I said, "Which conversation is that?" She said, "The one where Eric understands that we were always paying attention." That conversation, apparently, was this one, 22 years later, in a study in Boise on a Thursday afternoon that had arrived through a completely different door than anyone expected. I told Eric this while he sat in his chair and looked at the watch on the desk. I told him all of it, the budget, the months, the box in the drawer, the decision not to give it to him when he came through, but to preserve it for something she couldn't name but trusted would eventually make itself clear. When I finished, he picked up the watch. He held it in both hands the way I'd held the key, like something that needed to be handled with more care than its size suggested. He said, "She never told me." I said, "No." He said, "Why didn't she just give me the money when things were hard?" I said, "I asked her that." He looked at me. I said, "She said giving you the money would have told you she thought you needed rescuing. She didn't think you needed rescuing. She thought you needed to know that someone was watching carefully enough to know what you were going through." He sat with that. Lauren was watching him. She had a particular expression that I don't think she was aware of. The kind that appears on a person's face when they are watching someone they love receive something privately important and understanding, for the first time, the shape of a love that existed before they arrived. I gave the moment its space. Then I reached into the safe and took out the photographs. There are 6 of them, all adults. No events I could identify from context alone, just people in the ordinary circumstances of ordinary days. 2 of them are people I recognized immediately. The others I had to learn about, because Margaret had kept a small index card in the envelope, beside the photographs with notes in her handwriting about who each person was and why she had their photograph. The first photograph I put on the desk was of a woman named Doris, who had been Margaret's supervisor at the community center, where Margaret volunteered on Wednesday mornings for 11 years. Doris had done something specific for Margaret during a period when Margaret was dealing with health concerns she hadn't fully shared with me at the time. She had rearranged schedules, quietly without being asked, so that Margaret could attend appointments without having to explain herself to anyone. She had simply made space. Margaret had kept her photograph because she believed that kind of quiet consideration deserved to be remembered. The second photograph was of a man named Arthur, who had been a neighbor on the street before the house where Eric grew up in the earlier part of our lives together. Arthur had lent me tools once during a difficult winter repair and then never asked for them back and never mentioned it. Small thing. But Margaret had noted on the index card that it was during a week when the budget was particularly tight, and the cost of buying the tools ourselves would have meant something else going without. She remembered that. 11 years after Arthur had moved to another state, his photograph was still in the safe. I went through each one. I explained what Margaret had written on the index card, who the person was, what they had done, why she considered it worth preserving. Eric and Lauren listened without interrupting. This is something I want to tell you about, because it matters to the story. The quality of their listening changed somewhere in the middle of the photographs. At the beginning, they were listening the way people listen, when they're still trying to understand what category of information they're receiving, still calibrating, still holding a question open about where this is going. By the third photograph, something had shifted. They were simply listening, present in the room in a way they hadn't been when they walked in. That shift was Margaret's doing, not mine. I was only the custodian. She was the architect. The notebook came next. It's a small composition notebook, the kind with the black and white marbled cover that you find in stationery aisles. Margaret's handwriting fills about 2/3 of it. The rest is blank. I have never read all of it. I read enough to understand what it was, and then I closed it, because there are things in a person's private writing that belong to that person even after they're no longer there to protect them. What I read was enough. It is a record of gratitude, not gratitude in the general sense, specific gratitude, dated entries, most of them short, describing things that had happened and the specific quality of the thing that made her want to write it down. A conversation with a checkout clerk who had noticed she looked tired and said something kind about it. A letter she'd received from an old friend that arrived during a difficult week. A morning when the light came through the kitchen window at a particular angle, and she'd stood there with her coffee and felt for a moment entirely at peace. She wrote it down because she believed it deserved to be written down, that's all. There was no audience intended, no performance of sentiment, just a woman who thought the small good things in a life deserved the same preservation as the documents and the records and the objects. When I told them what was in the notebook without opening it, Lauren said something unexpected. She said she kept that private. It wasn't a question. It was a statement that functioned as a boundary she was drawing for herself. She was telling me, and maybe telling herself, that she understood the notebook wasn't something to be read at the desk on a Thursday afternoon by people who hadn't known they were coming to receive it. I said, "Yes." She said, "Can I see the cover?" I held it up. She looked at it. The marbled black and white cover worn at the corners from years in the safe. Nothing written on the outside. She nodded once. I put it back. Let me stop here for a second, because I know people watching this are bringing their own histories to this room with me, and I want to acknowledge that. If something in this story is reaching somewhere real inside you, I think that's exactly what Margaret would have wanted. That's the whole point of what she built inside that safe. Not privacy for its own sake. Preservation with intention. Keeping things until the right moment so they can do the right work. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, I'd ask you to do that now. Stay with this story. Because what came out of the safe after the notebook was the thing I've thought about more than anything else in the 11 years since Margaret left. The thing she told me specifically, with her hand on my arm and her eyes very steady, never to open until the moment was right. I'm going to tell you what was in that wrapped package. But first, let me tell you about the sealed envelope, because the envelope is where this story changes direction in a way that nobody in that room was prepared for, including Lauren. And what Lauren did when she understood what the envelope meant is the part that I still carry with me when I sit in the study in the mornings and look at the safe and think about my wife and the particular quality of the love she practiced, which was not the loud kind, not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that works in the background for decades, building something the people it's meant for won't understand until they're ready. The envelope was sealed with tape across the flap, the old kind, the kind that dries out and loses its adhesion over time so that by now the tape is more symbolic than structural. Margaret had written one word on the front of the envelope in her largest, most deliberate handwriting. The word was Lauren. Now. Let me tell you how the room felt when I set that envelope on the desk. Because I've described a lot of this afternoon to you already, and you have a sense of the temperature of it, the particular mixture of tension and bewilderment and slow recalibration that had been building since Lauren opened the safe and looked inside. But when I placed the envelope on the desk with that name written on it in Margaret's handwriting, the temperature in the room changed again. Lauren looked at it the way you look at something you weren't expecting to see put on a surface in front of you. Her name, written by a woman who had been dead for 11 years, placed in a safe in 2003 or sometime thereabouts, addressed to her. Lauren had been part of this family for 18 years by the time Margaret died. She and Eric had been together for 7 years before that. Margaret had known Lauren for a significant portion of Lauren's adult life. They had been in the same rooms at holidays, at ordinary dinners, at the kinds of gatherings that adult families have when they're not performing closeness, but simply maintaining it. They had talked. They had helped each other in the kitchen. They had had conversations that were not deep by any external measure, but that accumulated over years into something that had its own texture and its own truth. But Lauren had not known that Margaret had written her a letter. She had not known Margaret had sealed it and put it in a safe and told her husband not to let it out until the right moment. She had come to this house expecting financial information. She had found, instead, her name in a dead woman's handwriting. Eric said, very quietly, "Mom wrote that." It wasn't a question. I said, "She wrote it the spring before she passed. I didn't watch her write it. I found it in the safe when I went through it the first time, 8 months after she was gone. It was in the back, behind everything else. She'd placed it there deliberately." Lauren's hands were in her lap. She was looking at the envelope, but not reaching for it. I said, "You don't have to open it today." She said, "Did you read it?" I said, "No." She looked at me. I said, "It says your name on it. It wasn't mine to read." The room was very still. Eric reached across and put his hand over Lauren's hands where they sat in her lap. He didn't say anything, just put his hand there. She looked down at his hand, then up at the envelope. Then she reached out and picked it up. She held it for a moment. You could see her deciding something. One of those internal negotiations that happen in a few seconds and determine the next several years. She opened it. She unfolded the letter inside. 2 pages, both sides of the first sheet used, and about a third of the second. Margaret's handwriting, familiar to anyone who'd received a card from her over the years, slightly right-leaning, each letter formed with the care of someone who grew up when penmanship was taught as a skill worth having. She read it. I watched her the way I'd watched her when the safe first opened. Not intrusively, just attentively. The way you watch someone you've known for many years do something that reveals a part of them you've seen before but couldn't quite name. There was a moment, somewhere in the second paragraph from what I could estimate, where her breathing changed. Not dramatically, just a slight deepening, the kind that happens when something lands. There was another moment, near the end, where she stopped reading for a few seconds and looked at the window, the creek outside, the gray afternoon light. Then she went back to the page. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully along its original creases. She placed it back in the envelope. She held the envelope in both hands. She didn't speak for a long time. Eric was watching her. I was watching her. The room was doing that thing it does when something important has just happened inside it and hasn't been spoken yet. Then Lauren said, "She knew." I said, "What did she know?" Lauren looked at me. Her eyes were clear, not tearful now, something beyond tears, the particular clearness that arrives after the emotional weather, passes through and leaves the light different. She said, "She knew why I was always worried. She knew what it came from. And she wrote it down because she wanted me to know she understood it." I said, "Yes." She said, "She never said anything, not once. All the years we knew each other, she never brought it up." I said, "No?" Lauren was quiet. Then she said, "There's a line in this letter." She didn't open the envelope again. She'd retained it. That told me a lot about how carefully she'd read it. She said, she wrote, "Never measure the safety of your future by what another person is willing to give you." The room received that. Eric's hand was still over hers. I didn't speak immediately. The line was Margaret's. It had been waiting 11 years for the person it was addressed to. It didn't need me to frame it or contextualize it or soften its landing. It had landed exactly where it was aimed. What I will tell you is what I was thinking when Lauren said it out loud. I was thinking about the specific geometry of what Margaret had understood and when she had understood it. She had written that letter knowing that Lauren's particular relationship with financial security ran deep enough to affect how she moved through the world. She had written it knowing that someday, in some form, that fear might put Lauren in a position that she would later wish she could approach differently. She had not written it as a prediction. She had written it as a preparation. There is a difference. A prediction says, "I know what you're going to do." A preparation says, "Whatever you encounter, here's something that might help you find your footing." Margaret had never stopped being a woman who prepared. Eric eventually said, "What else does it say, if you want to share it?" Lauren thought about that. She said she saw how hard I worked to make things feel secure. And she said she'd always admired it. But she said there's a kind of worry that becomes its own prison if you don't recognize it for what it is. She paused. She said the things worth holding on to aren't usually the things you can put in a safe. That sentence crossed the room quietly and found us each separately. I thought about the postal identification card in the safe, the one from my first year on the routes, which Margaret had kept because she said it was the year she understood what kind of man I intended to be. Not a wealthy man, a reliable one. I thought about the watch on the desk and the 11 years it had sat unwound at 4:22 waiting for the conversation it was built for. I thought about the notebook with its 2/3 of entries and its 1/3 of blank pages, the blank pages being, I had always imagined, the part of the story that was still being written. I thought about the wrapped package, which was still in the safe, which I had not yet brought out, which was the last item, the one Margaret had been most specific about. "Not yet," she had said. "You'll know when." Eric asked me about the postal identification card. He wanted to know why Margaret had kept it. I told him what I knew, which was that she had placed it in the safe herself and left a note with it that said simply, "This is where it started." He didn't entirely follow. I explained. The Postal Service career began as a practical decision. I needed work that was stable and physical and would build toward a pension in an era when pensions were still things you could count on if you made the right choices. I wasn't pursuing a passion. I was pursuing reliability. The first year was hard. The routes were long, and the supervisors then were not always patient, and the physical demands were more significant than I had anticipated. Margaret had watched me that year. She'd watched me come home tired in ways that went beyond the physical. She'd watched me recalibrate. She'd watched me decide, somewhere in that first year, that if I was going to spend decades doing this work, I was going to do it with the kind of investment that made it mean something rather than just the kind that made it bearable. She had seen the decision get made. She kept the card because the card was from before the decision. She said it represented the last time I did something only for practical reasons. Everything after it, she said, I did with intention. I don't know if that's entirely accurate, but it's what she believed. Eric looked at the card for a long time. Then he said something that surprised me. He said, I always thought the Postal Service thing was just what you ended up doing. I didn't know it was a choice you made while you were already in it. I said, most of the important choices don't happen before you start something. They happen after, when you realize you can leave or you can commit. He sat with that. Lauren was still holding the envelope with her name on it. I looked at both of them sitting in that study with the afternoon going gray outside the window, and I thought about all the things we don't say in families because we assume the people we love are receiving the things we mean without us having to articulate them, the assumptions we make about what's been understood, the things we carry privately that we intend to share someday when the moment feels right. I thought about the Thursday afternoon arriving the way it did, through a door I hadn't been expecting, with a hand extended for a key. And I thought, maybe this is what Margaret meant by you'll know. Not a gentle moment, not a quiet Sunday conversation over coffee. A Thursday, when someone's fear finally made itself completely visible and the only way through it was to open the door. Now, I want to say something to you directly because I've been telling this story for a while now, and I think you deserve to know that it gets harder before it gets quieter. There is still the wrapped package. And before I get to what's inside it, there's a conversation that needs to happen in that study between me and my son. A real one. The kind Eric had been avoiding since they pulled up in the driveway. The kind that had to happen before anything in that safe could do what Margaret built it to do. Because Lauren's letter was for Lauren. But what I had to say to Eric was for Eric. And it was the part of that afternoon I had not planned for. The part that arrived not from the safe, but from the 30 years of watching my son navigate the space between what he believed and what he did when those two things pulled in different directions. It was the hardest part. And it started with me asking him a question that had nothing to do with Margaret. A question about the moment Lauren had held out her hand, and what Eric had chosen to do with the moment before it arrived. I asked Lauren to give us a few minutes. She didn't hesitate. She stood up, still holding the envelope with her name on it, and she stepped out of the study and pulled the door most of the way closed behind her. Not all the way, just enough to make the room feel private without making it feel sealed. I listened to her footsteps on the hallway floor. She went toward the kitchen. I heard the quiet sound of a cabinet opening, then the faucet, briefly. She was giving us the room the way a person gives a room to people who need it, practically and without performance. I turned to Eric. He was looking at the desk, at the watch still sitting there, at the postal card beside it, at the small assembly of objects that had come out of the safe and arranged themselves into something that looked, from a certain angle, like a partial map of a life. I said, "Tell me what happened before you came here today." He looked up. I said, "Not what Lauren decided. What you decided." He was quiet for a moment. That particular quiet of his that I've known since he was old enough to have thoughts worth protecting. The quiet that means he's deciding how much of the truth to bring into the open and how much to keep in the part of himself that he manages alone. I said, "Eric, I'm 74 years old, and I have spent a very large portion of those years watching you negotiate with yourself. I know what it looks like. I'm asking you to stop doing it for the length of this conversation." He looked at me the way adults look at their parents when a parent says something that's accurate enough to be uncomfortable. Then he said, "I knew she was going to ask you for the key." I said, "I know you knew." He said, "I thought if she actually saw what was in there, it would help." I said, "How?" He said, "Because she's been building this up in her head for months. The idea of the safe, what might be in it. I thought if she could just see that it wasn't what she imagined, she'd be able to let it go." I said, "So you brought her here to let her down gently." He heard how that sounded. He said, "That's not how I thought about it." I said, "How did you think about it?" He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I thought, if Dad just explains it, she'll understand. And I won't have to be the one who tells her she's wrong." There it was. That was the sentence I'd been waiting for since they walked in. The one that lived underneath all the other sentences. The one that explained why Eric had stood in the doorway with his eyes on the floor while his wife extended her hand and asked for access to his father's private safe. He hadn't come here to support her. He hadn't come here to challenge her. He'd come here to let the situation resolve itself so that he could remain in the position he has always preferred, which is the position of a man who loves the people around him and would prefer, above almost anything else, that those people never require him to stand between them. I understand that about my son. I said earlier it's not a character flaw, exactly, but I want to be more precise about that now because I think precision matters here. It is not cruelty. It is not indifference. Eric loves Lauren, and he loves me, and the love is genuine in both directions. But there is a kind of abdication that can live inside genuine love without either person fully recognizing it. A way of stepping back at the moments that require stepping forward and telling yourself that the stepping back is actually a form of respect for the other person's autonomy. It isn't. Sometimes stepping back is just stepping back. And the people on either side of the space you've left are the ones who have to manage what fills it. I said, when Lauren told you she wanted the key, what did you say to her? He said, I said I didn't think it was a good idea. I said, and then? He said, she explained why she thought it was, and He stopped. I said, you let her convince you. He said, I didn't want to fight about it. I said, I know. I said it without judgment. I meant it without judgment. But I also meant what came next. I said, Eric, here is what I want you to understand about what happened in this room today. Your wife walked in here and asked me for access to something private. She asked because she was afraid, and fear does things to people that they don't always recognize while the fear is running. I'm not angry at Lauren for asking. But she asked because nobody who was in a position to tell her clearly that the question crossed a line actually told her clearly. He opened his mouth. I said, I'm not finished. He closed it. I said, you were in that position, not me. I'm his father. My telling her no would have been a confrontation between a father-in-law and a daughter-in-law that would have ended with Lauren feeling judged and you in the middle of something you'd have managed quietly for months. You were the one who could have told her privately at home before it came to this. Lauren, my father's safe is private. Whatever's in it belongs to him. We don't get to ask for it. He looked at the desk. I said, that conversation would have been hard. She would have been frustrated. You would have had to hold your position while she was frustrated, which I know is not comfortable for you. But it would have been the honest thing. And it would have saved your wife from walking into her father-in-law's study and asking for something that was never hers to ask for. The room was quiet. I let it be quiet. Outside, very faintly, I could hear Lauren in the kitchen, the sound of a chair moving slightly. She was sitting down, waiting in the patient, self-contained way that she waits for things, which is one of her genuine qualities, even when the thing she's waiting for is not hers to have. Eric said, you're right. I said, I know I'm right. I'm telling you because I think you need to hear it from me rather than arriving at it yourself quietly and carrying it without saying it out loud to anyone. He said, I should have told her no. I said, you should have told her the truth, which is that you didn't know what was in the safe any more than she did, and that it wasn't your place to find out, and that whatever your father has kept private in his own home is his to keep private for exactly as long as he chooses. He nodded. I said, you can love someone completely and still maintain a boundary on their behalf. Those two things are not in conflict. The boundary is part of the love. It says, I know what belongs to you and I know what doesn't, and I will not let my own discomfort with conflict be the reason those two things get confused. Eric was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that I hadn't expected. He said, Mom would have said something like that. I said, I know. I learned it from her. He almost smiled. The almost smile that's been on his face since he was in his 20s, and something catches him off guard by being true. He said, I'm going to talk to Lauren. I said, I know you are. He said, tonight, properly. I said, good. He picked up the watch from the desk. He looked at it again. The face stopped at 4:22, the silver casing worn soft at the edges from all the years it had spent not being worn. He said, can I keep this? I said, it's yours. It always was. He put it in his jacket pocket. It disappeared into the fabric the way small important things do, quietly, without ceremony. I called Lauren back. She came in without the hesitation of someone who wasn't sure of her welcome. She came in and sat back down in her chair and looked at the desk and at the remaining contents of the safe that I hadn't yet brought out. And she said, "There's still the wrapped one." I said, "There is." She said, "Do you know what's in it?" I said, "I have a strong sense of it, but I've never opened it." Eric looked at me. "Never?" I said. Margaret was specific. She said not until the moment was right. I decided I would know the moment when it arrived. Lauren said, "And has it?" I looked at the two of them sitting in the chairs in my study, my son with his mother's watch now in his pocket, his wife with the envelope in her hands and something different in her eyes than what had been there when she walked in. I said, "I think it has." I reached into the safe and took out the package. It's not large, about the size of a hardback book wrapped in the plain brown paper Margaret used for everything she wrapped, secured with ordinary twine tied in a knot that I recognized from 41 years of watching her tie it. She had a specific way of finishing a knot, a small extra loop at the end that made it hold without being difficult to undo, practical to the last detail. I set it on the desk. I didn't unwrap it immediately. I said, "Before I open this, I want to tell you both something." They waited. I said, "What happened today in this room was not what any of us planned. Lauren, you came here looking for something that would solve a problem you've been carrying. Eric, you came here hoping the situation would resolve without requiring anything difficult from you." I handed over the key because I'd been thinking for 11 years about when the right moment would arrive. And when you put your hand out, I understood that the moment had arrived, just not in the shape I'd imagined. I paused. I said, "Margaret built what's in this safe with a purpose. Not a financial purpose, a relational one. She was a woman who believed that the most important work you do for the people you love is the invisible work, the noticing, the preserving, the deciding to hold something until the moment it can do the most good." Lauren had her eyes on the package. I said, "Whatever is in here, I want you to understand that she put it here because she believed in this family, not in what this family owned, in what it was capable of being." I undid the knot. The paper came open in two folds the way well-wrapped things do. Inside was a notebook, smaller than the composition book, more personal, the kind with a cloth cover, dark green, soft at the edges, and resting on top of the notebook, a handwritten note on a single sheet of paper folded once. The note was addressed to me. I recognized Margaret's handwriting immediately. Though this was older than the other letter, the letters formed with more assurance, from a period before the arthritis had asked her to write more carefully. This was her natural hand. The one I'd read in grocery lists and birthday cards and the notes she sometimes left on the kitchen counter when she'd gone out early and wanted me to know she'd thought of me before she left. I unfolded it. I read it to myself first. I want to be honest about what happened when I read it. I'm 74 years old, and I've managed my emotional responses in a particular way for most of those years, which is to acknowledge them privately and present what's necessary publicly. That's not repression. It's temperament. It's the same quality that made me good at rote supervision and later at the longer patience required by life's larger demands. When I read that note, I sat at my desk in my study in Boise, Idaho, with my son and his wife in the chairs across from me, and I was quiet for longer than I'd planned to be. Eric said, "Dad?" I said, "Give me a moment." He gave me a moment. Lauren didn't speak. She understood, I think, that what was happening was not something that needed her to manage it. When I was ready, I read the note aloud. Margaret had written, "If you're reading this in the right moment, then you figured it out. You always did take longer than necessary, but you always got there. The notebook is for you." I started it the year after Eric got married, and I wrote in it every time I noticed something about this family that I thought deserved to be remembered. Not the big occasions, the ordinary ones, the Tuesday dinners and the phone calls and the small ways people show you who they are when they're not performing anything. I want you to know that I understood what you were doing when you kept all of this. You were doing what you always do, which is being careful with things that matter. I hope whoever is in the room with you when you read this understands that too, and I hope that whatever brought them to the safe, whatever they were looking for, they found something better than what they expected. That was all. No grand conclusion, no elegant final line designed to land as a revelation. Just Margaret, writing to me the way she wrote to me for 41 years, which was directly, with full confidence that I would understand what she meant, and that understanding it would be enough. The room received the note the way the other things had been received, in a silence that was not empty but full. Lauren was the first to speak. She said, "She wrote a notebook about the ordinary days." I said, "Yes." She said, "And she kept it for you?" I said, "Yes." Lauren looked at the green cloth notebook sitting on the desk. She didn't reach for it. She looked at it the way she'd looked at the composition notebook earlier, with the particular respect of someone who understands that some things exist for someone else. She said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Go ahead." She said, "When I walked in here today and asked for the key, what did you actually think when I said it?" I considered that question for a moment. It deserved a real answer. I said, "I thought, she's afraid." And I thought, she's been afraid for a long time, and the fear has gotten big enough that it's pushing her towards something she wouldn't otherwise do. Lauren looked at her hands. I said, "I wasn't angry, Lauren. I want to be clear about that. Anger would have required me to believe you were acting from a bad place. I don't believe that. I think you were acting from a frightened place, which is a different thing entirely." She said, "I still shouldn't have asked." I said, "No, you shouldn't have." I said it simply, not harshly, just honestly. The same way I'd been honest with Eric. The same way Margaret would have said it, directly and without the cruelty that sometimes gets confused with directness. She said, "I've been telling myself for months that I had a right to know what was in there. That if there was something that could help us, it wasn't fair for you to keep it private." I said, "I understand how that reasoning builds." She said, "But it's not my safe." I said, "No." She said, "And whatever's in it, it was never going to be the thing that fixed what we're worried about." I said, "No, it wasn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said the thing that I think took the most from her to say, the thing that required her to set down the armor she'd been carrying the longest. She said, "I've been doing this my whole life, finding the thing that I think will make everything secure. And then when I can't get to it, I find the next thing. And none of them ever actually make me feel the way I think they will." I said, "I know." She looked at me. I said, "Margaret knew too. She saw it years ago. She didn't mention it to you because she wasn't trying to correct you. She was trying to tell you that she understood you. That's different." Lauren's eyes went to the envelope in her lap. She said, the safety I'm looking for isn't something anyone else can give me." I said, "She was right." She said, "I know she was right. I've known it for a long time. Knowing something and living differently because of it are two different things." I said, "Yes, they are. That's the work." Now let me speak to you directly for a moment, because this story is almost at its end, and I want to say something before we get there. There are people watching this right now who recognize Lauren's fear, not necessarily because of a safe or because of a family disagreement over money, but because of the specific quality of that fear, the one that builds quietly over years and shapes the way you move through the world and what you reach for when things feel uncertain. If that's you, I'd ask you to sit with what Margaret wrote. Not as advice from a stranger, as something a woman understood about a very human experience and chose to preserve rather than ignore. And if this story has found you at a moment when you needed it, I'd be glad if you stayed around. Subscribe if you haven't yet and turn on the bell. These stories are told for exactly this reason. Not to entertain with drama. To say true things about how families actually work and what happens when the honest conversations happen a little late, but happen anyway. The afternoon moved toward evening. We sat in the study for another hour. We talked about the financial situation Eric and Lauren were actually in, not in abstract terms, but in the specific terms of two adults who were trying to navigate something real. I listened. I asked questions. I didn't offer money, because money wasn't what the situation needed from me at that moment. It needed someone to listen without solving, which is a skill I've been practicing since Margaret taught me the distinction between the two. What I did offer was something more modest. I told them that the pressure they were describing, the particular shape of it, was manageable, not immediately and not without effort, but manageable. I'd seen the same shape of pressure in different forms over the course of a long life, and I'd seen people come through it, and I'd come through versions of it myself. The coming through was not guaranteed, but it was possible, and possibility, when a situation feels closed, is not a small thing. Lauren listened to that differently than she would have listened to it 2 hours earlier. Something had shifted in her that made her more able to receive it. Before they left, she did something I hadn't expected. She stood up, and she placed the envelope on the desk. She placed it carefully, not carelessly, the way you place something you've decided matters. I said, "You're leaving it?" She said, "I think you should keep it." I said, "Margaret addressed it to you." She said, I know, but I've read it, and I think... She paused, choosing the words, the way she'd been choosing everything more carefully in the last hour. I think some things are better kept by the person who understands the full weight of them. I said, you could take it home and keep it yourself. She said, I know I could, but you've been keeping these things for 11 years without losing any of what they meant. I trust you with it. I trust you with it. I've been carrying those words since that Thursday. They didn't resolve anything, practically speaking. The financial pressure didn't evaporate. The family didn't transform into something that never misunderstands itself. The safe didn't turn out to contain the thing anyone expected. But Lauren said, I trust you with it. And that was a different kind of exchange than the one that had happened at the start of the afternoon when she'd stood in the doorway with her hand extended. At the start, she was taking. At the end, she was giving. I put the envelope back in the safe. I placed Margaret's note to me on top of it. Then the green notebook. Then the small silver watch's empty space, because that was gone now, sitting in Eric's jacket pocket where it had been waiting 22 years to arrive. I closed the door. I did not lock it. I set the key on top of the safe and left it there. Eric noticed on his way to the door. He said, You're not locking it? I said, No. He said, Why not? I said, Because a locked door and a trusted door are two different things. I'd rather have the second one. He looked at the key sitting on top of the safe. He understood. They left through the front door. I watched from the window as they walked to the car. Eric with his hand at the small of Lauren's back the way he's always walked beside her, the watch invisible now in his pocket, but there, present, doing whatever a stopped watch does when it's finally where it belongs. The street was quiet. Winding Creek Avenue at dusk has a particular character. The light going gold through the trees along the creek bank, the sound of the water just audible if the traffic's thin enough. It's the kind of street that looks like it was designed to be lived on quietly for a long time. I went back to the study. I sat at the desk. I looked at the safe with its door closed and the key on top, and the 7 objects inside that were now 6, because the watch was gone, and that was exactly right. I thought about Margaret. I thought about 2003, the afternoon she came to me with her specific request. I want a place to keep them that won't get disturbed. I want to know they're somewhere safe. I thought about the particular quality of her faith in people. Not blind faith. Not the kind that ignores what it sees. The kind that sees clearly and then decides to believe in the better possibility anyway. The kind that writes a letter to a daughter-in-law who will someday come looking for the wrong thing and make sure she finds the right one instead. I sat there until the light outside changed completely and the study went from gold to gray to the particular blue of a Boise evening in the months when the days are still shortening. Then I got up and made dinner. Nothing significant. Soup from what was in the refrigerator. Bread from 2 days ago that was still good if you didn't expect it to be anything more than what it was. I ate at the kitchen table instead of the study, a different room. Fresh air in the meaning. Weeks passed. Lauren came back on a Saturday morning. She called first, which she hadn't done on the Thursday, and I thought that small difference said something real about where she'd arrived internally. She came alone without Eric, which also said something. This was her visit. Her choice. She brought a plant, a small one in a terracotta pot, something green and low maintenance that she said was good for indoor light. She set it on the kitchen windowsill and it looked exactly right there, which I told her. And she smiled in the full way, not the measured one. We had coffee. She told me things had shifted slightly at home. Not dramatically. She used the word differently. She said she was handling the financial worry differently. Still present, still real, but differently. She said she'd been thinking about what Margaret wrote about measuring safety by what others are willing to give. She said she'd been trying to notice when she was doing that and choose a different direction when she caught it. She said it wasn't easy. I said, no, it isn't. She said, but it's the right work. I said, yes, it is. We sat for a while. The plant on the windowsill caught the morning light and held it the way green things do. Before she left, she said something I want to end with because I think it's the truest thing that came out of any of it. She said it casually, almost at the door, the way the truest things often arrive, sideways, without announcement. She said, I came here that Thursday thinking the valuable thing was locked away. I said, I know. She said, it wasn't locked away at all. It was just waiting to be understood. I said, that's what Margaret built it to do. She nodded. She left. I went back to the kitchen and looked at the plant on the windowsill for a while. Then I went to the study. I sat at the desk. I looked at the safe, door closed, key still on top, the contents sitting in their own quiet in the dark inside. Some things are valuable precisely because they were never meant to be taken. Some doors are worth more open than locked. And some of the most important things a person keeps are not kept for themselves. They are kept in trust. For the moment when the person who needs them most finally arrives and asks the right question. On a Thursday afternoon in Boise, Idaho, Lauren asked the wrong question, but it was the question that led us all to the right room. And in the end, I think that's how Margaret planned it. She always did know how to get people where they needed to go, even from the other side of a locked door, even from 11 years away. That was enough. More than enough. If this story found you at the right moment, I'd like to hear about it. Leave a comment below and tell me what it brought up for you. Maybe you've been on Lauren's side of that desk, reaching for something you thought would make everything feel secure. Maybe you've been on mine, keeping something private and waiting for the right moment to let it mean what it was always meant to mean. These stories exist because these experiences are real, and real things deserve to be talked about out loud. Subscribe if you're not already here, and ring that bell so you don't miss what comes next. The stories I bring to this channel are built on the same foundation as everything Margaret kept in that safe. Memory, honesty, the belief that ordinary days contain extraordinary things if someone is paying close enough attention to write them down. I'll see you in the next one.